The gospel reading this morning is from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, verses 20 through 33. And now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the festival. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. "Sir," they said, "we would like to see Jesus." Philip went to tell Andrew. Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. And Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. And now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No. It was for this very reason that I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name." Then a voice came from heaven, "I have glorified it and will glorify it again." The crowd that was there and heard it said it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. And Jesus said, "This voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. This is the reading of the word of our Lord.
Thanks be to God.
You may be seated. Pretty complicated passage, isn't it? I highly recommend that you pray and read that for yourself, because it might take a few dozen times to sort through everything that was said there in John. Tough stuff. Begins with asking to see Jesus, and then the subject changes entirely, doesn't it? And very quickly. Well, this is a message about ministry. It's a message about serving people and God at the same time. It's a message about welcoming, forgiving, loving, and encouraging others. And it begins with this story. She hadn't intended to speak. In fact, she had thought she could sneak quietly into the church after the service began, sit in an inconspicuous place, and leave before it ended. She had no way of knowing before she got inside how open and exposed all of the seats in the small sanctuary were. Not at all like the huge churches they showed in TV shows and movies. All she had meant to do was sit quietly and somehow communicate to God her thankfulness that her son's life had been spared. But she had felt exposed ever since she sat down. She was afraid everyone was looking and wondering, what is she doing here? And then the pastor had asked if anyone had concerns and celebrations to share, and before she could control herself, she found her hand raised, just like she was in grade school again. The pastor nodded at her as nearly every eye in the church turned to look at her in the back pew. She swallowed to try and wet the inside of her mouth, where her tongue felt as if it were glued down. But as she pulled herself to her feet, she saw the kind, welcoming eyes of the woman from the hospital several rows ahead, and she knew what to say. Most of you know my name is Mary Paul. I've lived in this town all my life, and this is the first time I ever set foot in this church. My brothers and I have run the Whistle Stop Tavern ever since our dad died. Our family never had anything to do with church. Dad used to say it was a conflict of interest. A smile twitched the corner of her mouth, but she kept it from fully forming. The friendly woman nodded, though, and Mary kept going. I came in here today because I wanted to say thank you to God for the life of my son. I think you all know that Steve smashed up his car out on Highway 33 last Tuesday night. He's been in intensive care ever since, and they didn't give me much hope that he'd pull through. This morning at 7 o'clock, they said he turned the corner, and they think he'll live. Up until Saturday morning, I would have only thought to thank the doctors that he pulled through. But on Saturday, a member of this church called on Steve and me at the hospital. Some of the eyes of the congregation turned away from Mary at that point and rested on the friendly face that still smiled softly at her. And Mary pushed onward. I never met this woman before Saturday. I think she said her name is Eleanor, and I see her sitting over there. Well, Eleanor came into the waiting room when all my family and the people I call my friends had gone and talked to me, just like I was her friend. She said how sorry she was about Steve and how she heard that the accident wasn't his fault, which is just the opposite of what everyone else was either saying or thinking. She asked if we could go into his room in the ICU together so she could say a prayer for him. Now, I'm not much one for praying. What my life has been like is no secret in this town. But she was so nice, and her caring was so real that I said yes. And when she touched Steve's hand, with all those tubes and needles hooked in it, and prayed to God that he would be all right, well, I prayed that too. I prayed for the first time I can remember in my whole life. And this morning they tell me Steve is going to pull through. The lump in her throat that had taken the place of the dryness choked off most of her last words. She looked down, embarrassed, when tears escaped from her eyes and began to run down her face and nose. It just wasn't like her to cry over anything. And then she remembered the point she was trying to make, ignored the tears, and looked directly back at the congregation, most of whom now looked surprised. Anyhow, Mary said, on my way home I saw the cars here, and I just felt like I should come in and say thank you to God for my son's life. And while I'm at it, thank you, Eleanor, for being there at the right time for me and Steve. People like you are what goodness is really about. If there were more people like you, maybe I would have been brave enough to come in here and say thanks to God sooner. And then Mary Paul reached for her purse and keys on the pew and stepped out into the aisle to leave. But when she turned, Eleanor was standing beside her and took her arm and led her forward to the pew where she had been sitting. And through the rest of the service, they shared a bulletin and a hymnal and Christ's peace. Okay, I've read that story 10,000 times. And it still gets to me. I'm not even sure exactly why it gets to me. It's pretty amazing to think about the impact that a single person can have on someone's life, isn't it? It's pretty amazing to think that someone, anyone, can walk into a hospital, can walk into a supermarket, can walk into the library, can go somewhere where they meet someone else and touch their lives in such a profound way that it makes all the difference. We have that opportunity every day. We have that opportunity multiple times every day for most of us. And we need to use them. I wonder if maybe it's the guilt I feel for the needy people that I ignored in my life. We've all done it, right? We all felt like we didn't have the energy to give that day when somebody obviously needed to receive. I've walked past the needy person too many times in my life. I've walked past the person that I had the opportunity to invite to be part of a fellowship with me, and I didn't invite them. I had the conversation. I had the opening. God set up the meeting, and did I follow through? No, didn't follow through. An opportunity that was lost. You see, the interesting thing is that Christianity isn't about guilt, and it isn't about lost opportunities. It's about grace, it's about forgiveness, and it's about new opportunities. For every opportunity that we have lost, we will be given multiple more opportunities to get it right. And that's what we should be looking forward to, that new opportunity to get it right. We are already redeemed from the person we passed by yesterday. Did you know that? We are already forgiven for the person that we passed by yesterday, for the visit that was not made. But what will we do about the person who needs us tomorrow? And that's really what I want to talk about today. So we as a church do what I call corporate ministry really well. Okay? Corporate ministry is the kind of ministry whether we gather an offering together and send it off to some place in the world where it's really needed. We do that really good. We do corporate ministry in the sense that we gather items for folks that are in need and make sure that they go to the food pantry or wherever they're needed. We do that really well as a congregation. I call that corporate ministry. Here's the part where we tend to be more neglectful, and that is what I call personal ministry. It's a whole lot easier to contribute to something, a cause, than it is to take it on by ourselves or to take on a person's needs by ourselves. That's personal ministry. That's when we have the opportunity to touch a life the way that life was touched in our story today. So, we have these ideas a lot of times that the pastor is responsible for the personal ministry in our church. I remember when I first became a pastor, and this may sound really strange to you, it was many, many years ago, I literally went through a time of mourning when I became a pastor. And the reason I went through that mourning is because I realized suddenly that people would believe I was there visiting them simply because it was my job. You see, before I was a pastor, I used to visit people. I used to pray with people. I did ministry. I helped the pastor, when they couldn't be there to do ministry. I would do that. And people were always astounded. They couldn't believe it. In fact, I don't know if I'm allowed to use this word in the county, but they were flabbergasted. Now, when I was growing up, lots of people were flabbergasted all the time, that's just a common word that I heard over and over. People were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe that an ordinary, everyday pew sitter would suddenly come in and offer to be there for them in their time of need. Oh, the pastor they could believe. Yeah, because it's the pastor's job, right? You see the difference that is? In other words, you have more power to touch a person's life than I do. You ever thought about that before? Because a lot of times you think the same thing. If there's going to be a visit done, the pastor can do it, right? It's his job. Yeah, it's his job. Except when you do it, and it's not your job, it makes a bigger difference than when I do it. Well, I want to tell you this, and it's one of the criticisms that you will get from me over the years here. It's not biblical exactly, but I believe that it contains truth. And the truth is that if we are feeding others, we will be fed. Do you know that? Even the secular world knows that. It's not just a religious thing. It's not just a denominational thing. It's not just a Christian thing. The fact is that if you are suffering and you can't get past something in your life and you go to a counselor, the counselor's going to tell you, go do some volunteer work somewhere. That's what they're going to tell you. Go to the hospital, go to the school, go to the library, go somewhere and do some volunteer work with others, because they know that when you are giving, what happens? You receive. The thing you need and want the most, you get back when you give. Sometimes we come to church because we like the pastor. Sometimes we leave the church because we don't like the pastor. Sometimes we leave because the pastor's not feeding us. But Christ calls us all to do the feeding, not just me. No, not just me. We're all supposed to do the feeding. And, as I said before, if we are feeding, we will be fed. Now, the correlation is pretty simple. If you feel like you're not being fed, what's not happening? You're not feeding. Wow, that's scary. You mean I have to take responsibility for being fed? Come on! It's the pastor's job. So when you do one-on-one ministry with other people, they are, what's the word? Flabbergasted, right? Yeah, they're flabbergasted. Jeremiah 31:33, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. You see, Mary Paul already knew God. She didn't have to go into a church, did she, in order to know God? She didn't have to know godly people in order to know God. She didn't have to do anything to know God because God put His law in the minds and wrote it on the hearts of who? Everybody. Everybody. Every single person. You know, there are people in this world that say, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in right and wrong. Well, what's right and what's wrong? You see, the only reason they know what's right and what's wrong is because God wrote it on their hearts and put it in their minds. That's the only way they can know. That's the only basis for right and wrong. Otherwise, everything is relative. Everyone knows God. Mary Paul knew God. We only have to acknowledge His existence. Did you know there are people that have never been in a church in their entire life? That may seem strange, a strange idea. But there are people who have never been in a church in their entire lives, and it's worse than that. Most people, the majority of people in this world, have never been in a church in their entire lives. Not even for a funeral. Not even for Easter services or Christmas Eve. That's when, if you're going to go, you're going to go then. No, never been in a church. Never seen the inside of a church. Didn't have any idea how a sanctuary is configured. Doesn't have any idea how pews are laid out. Doesn't have any idea that the windows have color in them. No idea of any of that. Had no idea of the order of worship. Had no idea of the words that are said in worship. No idea. Never been a part of that. They don't understand what it is to be in church. So I wonder who our Eleanors are in this congregation. Who are the people that are brave enough to go out there and touch a hand or even hold it, say a prayer with someone, visit when there's a need? Who are our Eleanors? Because I got to tell you, the world is full of Mary Pauls, right? Full of them. The people that just need a hand touched, that just need a little prayer said. I know we have some Eleanors here. I know we do. I know we have people that are willing to hold a hand or say a prayer or just be with a person. I know when I first became pastor, sometimes you think you need to be saying something all the time, You go to the hospital and there's got to be words being said, and they've got to sound profound and really religious too, right? Because you're a pastor now, it's your job. Do you know what most people need? Just your presence. Just your presence. Just to be there with them. They don't need any profound words. Just be there, touching their spirits with yours by your very presence. We tend to do that more in an emergency, but there's lots of opportunities that don't constitute an emergency. And those are the times that we also need to be touching lives. John 12:26. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. You know, when I read that, it sounds an awful lot to me like, if you feed, you will be fed. Pretty much the same idea, right? Now here's another criticism. You can take it for truth or not. It's up to you. But God never works just one way. Never, ever. This is my observation, by the way. God never works just one way. When you go with the intent of being a blessing to someone else, what's going to happen? You're going to be blessed every single time. Who do you know? Who do you know right now that needs to be fed? God bless.